there, this is David Cochrane. I am the Research Director for the International Society for Astrological Research, and I am interviewing astrologers who are doing exciting research in astrology. And today we have Alex Trenoweth in England. I'm over here in Florida, and we're connected by Zoom. And she's doing some really cool research on children because she's a school teacher. And children grow and they develop, right? And there are astrological cycles. So what Alex has done is she's connected them. She's been studying, going into the biology, the sociology, the psychology of how children grow and develop, looking at planetary cycles, and aha, there's a connection, as we astrologers would think there is. So she's been researching this a long time, and she's going to tell us about her research. So Alex, tell us what you've been doing over there.
Well, as you have said, I'm an astrologer and a school teacher. I was an astrologer first, and my intention in being a teacher was to pay for astrology classes. And I thought I would have the weekends and Christmas and Easter and a long summer holiday to study astrology. But that lasted about one weekend before I realized it wasn't going to work. But you know, I found that I really enjoyed working with children, and although I found the school teaching very difficult and challenging because it took up all my time and energy, but I started to realize that there were some very interesting things happening with the development of children and its connections with astrology. So I also found some interesting things that correlate with the moon phase and behavior of children, which I think is very interesting and very useful for teachers and parents to be aware of. So,
all right.
So I'm going to show you a bit of a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk you through some stuff that I've been doing, show you some results, and kind of talk a little bit about my justification for doing this research. So I'm just going to share the screen and get started on the PowerPoint.
Excellent.
Okay, so
there we go. We see it.
Great, it's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that because I was a bit worried. Just give me a second here. So what I think is really important in doing research is that we have an astrological theory, and we all know the astrological theories behind many different things. And I've looked at Jupiter and Saturn and growth cycles, as you'll see in a second. But I also think it's important to look at what other people, other ways of thinking. So bringing in psychology and sociology, as you say, and tying it into statistics. So here is, I'll get rid of this box. So here's what roughly the age cycles are. You can see that Jupiter, I'm looking at Jupiter and Saturn in particular. So at 2, there's a Jupiter sextile, Jupiter by transit when they're 2 years old, the first waxing Jupiter square at 3. But my teaching at first focused just primarily on adolescence, which is 12, 14, and 15, those important cycles that are happening there. What I found, linking in external resources, is that there's a lot of brain development that is happening during adolescence. And this is something that has only been recently discovered in the past 10 years or so, because it was always thought that babies had the most, the quickest brain development. But we're now understanding that it's actually during adolescence that the brain development is happening. So just prior to the first Jupiter return and up to around the time of the Saturn opposition at 15 or 14 is when all this important development is going on. And some of my other research looks at the addictive behavior, and it starts in adolescence during all this brain development. So the brain continues to develop all the way up until about the mid-20s. And you can see these red areas here are sort of the reptilian inner part of the brain. And then the brain starts to develop on the outside of the blue part of the diagram. So you can see that it's less red and more blue, which shows the cerebral cortex developing after adolescence. And that's to do with reasoning and logic and a whole lot of other things to do with the developing brain. But here in England, what happens is with our funding is that instead of focusing on creating opportunities when the brain development is happening, what we do over here is that we focus our funding for intervention for exams, which is after the Saturn opposition, which I think is a tragedy because we're missing out on an opportunity. Something else I found that's really interesting is that girls, the peak development happens about a year before the boys. So their experience in education is that they're mature and ready to learn, whereas boys are a little bit less mature and more likely to get in trouble. And that certainly shows in the behavior data that I have, that it tends to be boys who get into trouble more than girls. And so I've often proposed that during this early adolescence, that maybe the gender should be divided so that boys and girls are educated separately, so that girls have a chance to gain confidence with their bodies without the boys being there. And boys can, play sports and have, an extended bit of time to socialize and learn other skills, and then bring them back together after the Saturn opposition. And another reason why I think that it's so important to look at this brain development and the astrological cycles is because this shows the cross-section of a 3-year-old. One is normal, and the other is a child who's had suffered extreme neglect. Now, those red areas we saw in a prior diagram shows here in the middle, and you can see that the inner part of the brain that controls reflexive behaviors is very well pronounced here in this diagram, whereas in a normal child it's not quite so strong. But at the Jupiter return, when all the brain development is happening, is when there's a window of opportunity for that child to catch up with his peers, if we understand that this child is a child in need. But what happens in the educational system is this is also the age where a child goes to a new school, and all the way the teachers have understood that child and educated that child are kind of lost in that transition process. And so a child who's been in trouble or who's been neglected is actually coming to a school as a stranger, because we don't have that information that carries forward into secondary school. So it creates a situation where the child is starting all over again with teachers, getting to know them all over again. And what I found is, as a secondary school teacher teaching 11 to 18-year-olds, I was completely ignorant of what happens in a primary school until I actually started teaching primary school, which is ages 3 to 11. So I'm a very rare teacher in that I've taught in both kinds of schools, and I've seen a lot of things. So not only am I kind of weird because I'm an astrologer, I'm also kind of weird that I've lasted in the profession for so long and have that special experience. So this is where I'm working at, trying to talk to other teachers about why it's so important to pass on the information that was collected in primary school and actually make sure that's passed forward into secondary school. And working with secondary schools as well to let them, to make them understand that what happens in primary school is very important, rather than just dismissing it as a kind of a playtime or not a very important time of education. But the teacher's biggest concern in secondary school or even in primary school is behavior. So I'm just going to highlight this one sentence here. A study of a sample of teachers shows they have problems with discipline. Discipline is the biggest worry for a teacher. How do you get children sitting still? How do you get them to learn? Whereas, I think that if we understand the cycles of development, we can actually target and put the intervention in at the crucial stages. So this is what good behavior looks like in a school. And this is why I'm always saying that the educational system is extremely outdated. The modern educational system is based on the industrial age, where it was the objective to create hardworking people who would work for little pay, do as they were told, sit down and not complain about it. And if you think about it, that's kind of what we expect out of our students. Good behavior is sitting down, being quiet, and doing what you're told by one teacher who teaches 30 children. It's meant to be time efficient and economically efficient, but it's all about 30 students progressing at the same rate. And with only one adult in charge, it's very challenging to encourage talents or to encourage students who are in either end of the extreme of the learning curves. So this is looking at some of the incident sheets that I've collected from a school's, anonymous schools database. And what it shows here, if I could just point you in this direction, is that at age 12, around the time of the first Jupiter return, is when the most incident sheets are received for poor behavior. And you can see by the age of 15, the child has calmed down, or sorry, the age group has calmed down, and they're entering exams, and they're more likely to behave. And this is about the time of the Saturn opposition. So this is HT6, means half term 6. So this is the last 6 weeks of summer. Here in England, we're in school until about the 3rd week of July. So it's from June to mid-July. And that's 2011. And here it is for another, the next academic year, and you can see it's more pronounced that Jupiter return children are more likely to be in trouble than the Saturn opposition children. Now, what I found very interesting too is that if you look at what children are getting into trouble for, you can see that these Jupiter return children are more likely to be in trouble for disruptive behavior, and this is during 2012, than the Saturn opposition children. Now this is replicated, you can see replicated 4 times, looking at different half terms. You can see that there's a huge difference. So this is half term for the Jupiter return children, and this is half term for the Saturn opposition children. So the colors match the half term. And you can see that for each one, it shows that the Jupiter return children are more in trouble for disruptive behavior. And if you look at being in trouble for not doing enough work, a Saturn word, you can see that the post-Saturn return children are more likely to be in trouble for not doing enough work, not doing their homework, not completing their coursework for their exams. And this is why I'm saying that this is kind of a tragedy, really, because any teacher will tell you that a bored child is a naughty child. And so it kind of says that we're not challenging our Jupiter return children, and we're putting too much emphasis on exams, which is kind of the backwards way of doing it. We should be focusing on creating opportunities for our Jupiter return children, helping them to maybe go on school trips, to take on a lot of different activities that are going to stimulate all that brain development. And here is that replicated 4 times. Again, the colors indicate different half terms, but you can see that the Saturn opposition children are more in trouble for not doing enough work. I also thought I had this odd experience, and I was having an exceptionally bad day with behavior. It was my job. I was in charge of a whole entire year group. So it's kind of like being like the head homeroom teacher, in that I was the one receiving all these incident sheets that had to be sorted out and followed up and everything. And we were just, there was other managers of each year in the office, and we were having this terrible day. And I was banned from making it known that I was an astrologer to my students and their parents, but the other teachers knew that I was an astrologer. And so they were giving me a bit of a hard time in the office, and one colleague said to me, it must be a full moon to have all these incident sheets. But I you know, thought to myself, well, it's not the full moon, it's actually a new moon. And so I thought to myself, I have a really interesting study if I could just develop the right methodology to answer that question. Are children more likely to misbehave at the new moon or the full moon? Because I thought this would be a great question, something that would be enormously helpful to teachers. But the idea that the full moon is when people go a little bit crazy is an example of communal reinforcement. It's something that it's a mixed bag of results if you look at across studies. So, you know, some studies will say it's the full moon, some studies will say it's the new moon, but I found that it's definitely the new moon. So I'm just going to go through a few of my results. So this is how I divided the lunar month. So I just want to talk you through. So the new moon, I'm also looking at a couple days before and a couple days after the new moon. So the new moon is right in the middle of a couple days afterwards. And the same with the full moon. I'm actually looking at a couple days ahead and after, before and after the full moon. And so the way I started is I just started off with a very small sample because I have a huge database it eventually took a very, very long time to sort it all out. But I just started with a very small sample of 3 months, about 1 term of incident sheets. And I manually began putting them in and counting them. And I felt that I had enough of a result that I could continue with the study and actually bring in more data. And so this is what I found. So for behavior from September 2012 to July 2013, that academic year, I found you can see that children were more likely to misbehave on the new moon than any other phase. And I removed the girls from the database because it's mostly boys that get into trouble. And in fact, we know it's the younger boys of the academic year that are more in trouble. They're just more immature than the others. We would call them Leos, but you know, we can't really talk about astrology and education. But even with the girls removed, we can, you know, even with the menstrual cycles and everything else, nothing was showing. There was no results at all. So this is just boys only. And again, you can see that it's on the new moon that boys are more likely to misbehave. Then I thought to myself, well, there's different kinds of new moons and full moons to do with the nodal latitude. So I also divided that up and looking at, you know, are children more likely to misbehave on eclipses? And what I found was that absolutely not. They're more likely to misbehave at the new moon at higher latitudes. So away from eclipses is when they're more likely to misbehave. So this is the academic year 2009 to July 2010. And I replicated it for a couple years later. The reason why I didn't do consecutive years is because I wanted to have a turnover of the cohort. So we couldn't just say that certain students were responding to the moon because they were of the same cohort. I wanted a different cohort, but you can see that I'm still getting a similar result. These are my p-values. These are phenomenal p-values. You know, there is no flies on my research. And, you know, I think that there'd be a lot, very, very few scientific studies that would come up with these p-values. I linked this result to what I thought would be to do with a lack of sleep. People are better rested on the new moon than they are in the full moon. And from my studies, I know that teenagers have a very disturbed circadian cycle. They find it very difficult to fall asleep as early as they did when they were younger students. So teenagers tend to stay up later and can't fall asleep until, you know, close to midnight, 1 o'clock. So I just thought that this result was because of this. They had more energy at the new moon because they were better rested. But what do children do? Teenagers do when they're tired. They get these energy drinks, which are now illegal for them to buy here in England. And these energy drinks further disturb the circadian cycle. So I also propose that teenagers start school a little bit later so that they can have that extra bit of rest in the morning. Whether or not this is ever going to be something that changes, I just don't, you know, I can't possibly know. But I'm hoping that with the research of other scientists, this might be something that will be considered. I find it very disturbing that we understand a lot about pupil behavior by looking at the data. And the question is, why does America spend more money incarcerating children than it does in educating people and teaching children how to cope in an ever-changing world? So, you know, I just think it seems a little bit, you know, that we're putting all our resources in the wrong areas. So I just give a little example here. It costs £65,000 to put a person into prison and £40,000 a year to keep them in prison. And with that amount of money, the number of criminals that we put into jail, we can use those resources to keep them out of prison and to help children and support children who are showing signs of behavioral problems much, much earlier than we actually do. So I thought all this lunar phase and behavior was special to teenagers. And this is where it gets tough to be a researcher, because when I started looking at primary school data, my theory was kind of blown to pieces, because this is just one term of primary school data. But you can see, I'm still working on this and still researching, but you can still see that the new moon is when children are misbehaving, even though they're much younger than the teenagers. It's also known that daytime sleepiness is a risk factor. There's a very interesting researcher called Adrian Raine, who's British. He couldn't really get enough respect to have his research taken seriously, so he actually migrated to the States. But he's looking at, I found it interesting, he's looking at EEG theta activity at the age of 15, which is the Saturn opposition, and then he's rechecking on them at the age of 29, which of course astrologers recognize as a Saturn return. I'm pretty sure Adrian Raine isn't an astrologer, that he just chose these dates, but I thought that was really interesting. But looking at the theta activity, it shows that sleepy adolescents were more likely to be antisocial during adolescence, and were 4.5 times more likely to commit a crime by the age of 29. And here he is looking at his research. And this is just, more results of what he's been doing. And I think he's really onto something here with his measuring of the brainwaves. I'm not proposing at all that we measure the brainwaves of all children, but if we don't do anything to help troubled children, then they're just going to grow up and end up in trouble, or on a more severe scale. So I think it's more logical to work towards keeping people out of prison than in putting them into prison. Okay, so that was really the results. I mean, I tried to stick to statistics on this. Like, see, I try to keep things as dry as I possibly could. I did do some interviews with teachers talking about, which is their preferred age group, which age group do they dislike the most. And a lot of teachers from my survey said they found 13-year-olds to be the most challenging. And 13-year-olds are experiencing, they've already had their Jupiter return, but they're having the Jupiter sextile. I'm talking about transiting Jupiter sextile to its natal position, as well as the first Ptolemaic aspect from an outer planet, which is transiting Uranus sextile to its own natal position at the same time. And that's happening before the Saturn opposition. So I think for me, there's a lot of research to look at in terms of, there's so much there, there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, so just to, underscore a few points here, what we're seeing is you're doing something not many astrologers are doing in combining biology, developmental cycles. You're integrating astrological research with other disciplines, which I think is marvelous. A lot of us,
thank you,
for the little bit of research that goes on in astrology, very little of it is interdisciplinary like that. So that's very exciting. And I have a few questions. One is, it's interesting that the children misbehaving around 12 to 13 a lot. It seems to be where a lot of the incidents are occurring, which is a Jupiter opposition Jupiter time around 12.
Jupiter return. Jupiter return. Yeah, Jupiter return. Yes, of course, 12 years.
So it's a Jupiterian time, and you showed the picture of kids almost in cages, right? So, that's the kind of heritage for education that we have, which is very anti-Jupiterian. So one thing that would be very interesting to look at is, do the children who have, say, a Sun-Jupiter aspect have more incidents? We think of Jupiter as the great benefic, but it's not so benefic in a case where you're restricting a person. So it would be interesting, just like you separated boys from girls in one study, it would be interesting if you could separate out the children who have some kind of Jupiterian emphasis, could be signs or houses or aspects, and see if they are, even higher than the others. So, these are interesting. There's so many things that could be looked at with this.
That would be very interesting. But I also think that as the adults in charge, as the authority figures, we have the ability to adjust our own behavior to be beneficial to the students. And what I always tell teachers who come to me for advice you know, astrological advice that is, you know, if you don't understand your Saturn, your students will, and they'll they'll press your buttons and you know, make you doubt yourself, and you know, you'll have all sorts of problems with discipline. So I think for the adults, it's very important that they have a good sense of self-understanding, and that makes them better parents and teachers. Because I work with the way I work, I call it the triage. I know everybody's Jupiter and Saturn. I know that you know that they're the year of birth, so it, you know, it's all running in there. But if a child is particularly troubled, what I do is I use their noon chart, and I look at how their planets, especially Jupiter and Saturn, because their inner planets aren't my business. Mercury, Venus, and all that isn't my my business, but their Jupiter and Saturn, how they learn and how they accept discipline is my business. And so I look at that and I decide how I can adjust my behavior to serve the needs of that child.
Right. So what we're seeing here is that one of the things to look at is the children's charts, the other is the teacher's charts, and the other is the relationship of the teachers to the children. And of course, all the different kinds of interventions or therapies that could be done to improve all these things. So, I mean, this is just a rich environment for a lot of exploration and improvement, you know, if more research can be done, which all is very time consuming. So
it is, but I you know, I feel very strongly that a lunar calendar should be in every staff room. And you know, if you know that the children are more likely to misbehave at the new moon, extra staff on duty, you know, more exciting lessons to keep busy minds occupied. Because as I said, a naughty child is a bored child. So you know, I think we need to get into the rhythm of the new moons and full moons, and have that lunar calendar there for us to be ready.
Yeah, well, this is outstanding. What we want to do in these interviews is open the door for the ESAR members and for other people to see that astrologers are out there collecting data, analyzing it in different ways, getting different lenses and perspectives on this. So, you know, I hope the people watching this really appreciate another way to go into things, and whatever field you're in, like you're in education, there's stuff to look at, to analyze, to get a better understanding of things. So I think we've gotten a good view of this. One of the last things I'd like to close with is, where can people get more information, literature, books, materials? Where can they go from here if they want to continue to learn more about what you're doing or do similar kinds of research?
Yes. Well, my book is called Growing Pains, and that just basically looks at the cycles of Jupiter and Saturn. And it's meant to be a book that is accessible for non-astrologers. I didn't write it for, you know, people that, you know, are advanced in astrology. It's meant to be accessible. And it gives general guidance on how to manage each Jupiter sign and each Saturn sign. And it has a case study for each of the signs. So for each Jupiter sign, Jupiter in Aries, there's a case study for Jupiter in all the signs, and then in Saturn and through all the signs too. So I use a lot of case studies, and you know, it's not meant to be complicated. People ask me about, you know, do I know the children's dates of birth? Of course I do. But if I'm teaching history, I have 480 students, and makes the data, that kind of data, completely unmanageable. It has to be manageable to a busy teacher. And that's what I was trying to create with this book called Growing Pains. And that's available on Amazon or through my publisher, Wessex Books. And I also have a website, alextrenoweth.co.uk. And you can find me on Facebook.
Okay, so we've got your website, you're on Facebook, you have the book, Growing Pains. So there are all these resources available. And I want to just emphasize this, your last point, is I think sometimes people think research is done in an ivory tower with loads of resources. And actually most research, like if you study the history of research, like in the early 20th century, a lot of it is very practical. It's based on the real life circumstances that we have limited resources. We you know, you have limited time, you have limited things you can do, but you still have managed, because you love astrology like we all do, you still manage to go in there, find important things, increase your own understanding by studying biology and the sociological studies and so on. So I just want to encourage people to not feel so despondent, because we're all busy. You know, we all have a lot of things, and research is often very limited because everybody's busy and has limited resources. So, you know, this is sort of an encouraging note that you've managed to carve out something despite the busyness of your wife. And I
If
think
I could do it,
a lot of
anybody
people
could do
relate
it.
to that. Yes.
Because I'm not I did not set out to find these. I didn't think they were there. I'm surprised. And if anybody can do it, if I can do it, anybody else can do it for sure. I started off being I wanted to be a behavioral psychologist. That lasted until I got to the statistics, and I left the course because I didn't want to do statistics. Well, that
Right.
came and bit me, So
Yeah.
it's hard. It's difficult. It's hard work, but it's absolutely right. It was because it was in my face that I followed it through.
Yeah, and it's exciting. You've discovered some things. So, so that I think we've pretty much covered. Is there anything else you want to say, Alex? I think.
We'll be talking a lot more in depth about Jupiter cycles for the Star Club. It's 24th of February, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for ESAR.
Right. Okay, excellent. So you'll be doing that Star Club presentation. All right, I think we've covered it. Again, what I like to do in these interviews is just show the world these things are going on. People are doing different kinds of research, and I think it's the future of astrology. We can't just sit back and wait for things to come to us. Go out there and figure stuff out and analyze it, which is what you're doing. All right, so I think we've covered it all. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks
everyone
David.
for watching. All righty, God bless. Namaste.
Thank you.